I will do good no matter what happens to me.
You tweeted, "Give them hell, Netanyahu, enough is enough." Do you wish you'd phrased that tweet differently? Do you have any regrets about it?
Well, absolute rejection of the idea of being a victim. Twitter is a very complicated social media platform. It's been difficult for me to learn how to use it wisely. If I was in Israel's shoes, I suppose I would likely do much the same as they are doing.
It's quite a sad demise that he's turned from being a very reputable psychologist, now suddenly using psychological terms as political tools to justify Israeli atrocities.
How do you identify the psychopathic pretenders?
He is essentially calling for censorship and for deplatforming people.
Those who choose to regulate end up being precisely those who you would not want to regulate. You've let your curiosity guide you. How do you draw the line? It's the people at the bottom of the hierarchy whose right to expression needs to be protected. How should anyone decide what guardrails to put up? Like, what do you look for?
He knows exactly what he wants to say, but he's trying to find the words to say it in a way which isn't inflammatory, because it is actually inflammatory.
He is essentially an apologist for a Judeo-Christian supremacy.
The idea that our culture is Judeo-Christian is just not true.
This Judeo-Christian framework means that you see a lack of value in people who are outside of that. That enables you to justify their killing and slaughtering for the sake of that Judeo-Christian framework.
In a shocking twist of fate, right-wing influencers are asking Joe Rogan to make his podcast a safe space. Let's take a look at Jordan Peterson in a recent clip.
Conversation up, but it poked up and made itself manifest in that conversation. And the issue is, how do you identify the psychopathic pretenders? And it's even worse now, and then make a barrier, right? Now, the right was calling for the left to do that for decades.
Right.
And they didn't, and they couldn't. And the left is not good at drawing barriers, partly temperamentally. The right is somewhat better, but there's no shortage of monstrosity there. And so then the question is, how do you draw the line? And that's kind of what I was, because I've been watching these right-wing, they're not right-wing, these psychopathic types manipulate the edge of the conservative movement for their own gain.
Right.
And a lot of that's cloaked in anti-Semitic guise. There's plenty of anti-Semitism on the left too, by the way. So it's not unique to the right.
Well,
but
particularly now.
Yes, particularly now.
Right.
And so, you've let your curiosity guide you, your curiosity and your desire for knowledge, this quest, you've let that guide you as a podcaster. And by the way, I'm trying to work through exactly the same sort of thing. How do you know, given your radical increase in stature over the last 10 years, how do you know when your curiosity and even your skepticism about the fact that things aren't the way that people say they are, because that's certainly been demonstrated in the last 10 years, how should anyone decide what guardrails to put up? Like, what do you look for? Do you have a conceptual system worked out for that? Like,
So, Daily Wire host Jordan Peterson. Daily Wire is obviously owned by Ben Shapiro, who is known to be partial to Israel, as far as I understand. He's gone on to this to Joe Rogan after the Douglas Murray and Dave Smith clash. A lot of our audience will probably be familiar with this. Can you quickly summarize what happened, that whole affair, in a minute or so?
So Dave Smith is he's on the right, he's libertarian, but he's fiercely critical of Israel, especially with recent slaughter and mass slaughter in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And he was speaking on the Joe Rogan podcast with Douglas Murray, that's right, who's very British and but perhaps puts on a bit of an accent and actually only has a BSc in English literature, funnily enough. And he was basically talking to him about the Israel issue, and Douglas Murray was completely out of his depth, like beyond out of his depth. And Douglas Murray advanced the principal argument, which is that unless you've been somewhere, you can't really comment on it, which is extraordinary because Douglas Murray likes to opine on everything under the sun, which he's got no experience of whatsoever. So that was there was a huge backlash online against Douglas Murray and the pro-Israel lobby. And as a result of that, I think to kind of temper it and to kind of give a little bit of so-called balance to the issue, they brought Jordan Peterson on as the good cop after the bad cop, which was Douglas Murray on Israel. And so Jordan Peterson comes on Joe Rogan's show and he starts talking also about Israel. He's like, well, how do you set up and make sure your curiosity doesn't lead you into unacceptable territory and unacceptable conversations effectively? And what guardrails in our psychological cognitive space do we implement to make sure that we don't upset Israel?
Yeah, well, that's what a lot of people have accused him of quite credibly of doing. And, we don't know if Jordan Peterson was already scheduled, but either way, he did appear like a week or so after, parroting basically the same attack line that trying to undermine the credibility of the arguments against Israel by undermining the credibility of the guests.
Yeah, by calling them psychopathic pretenders. They are using the issue. This is fundamentally what we were saying. They are using the issue of Israel to gain followers, to gain clicks, to gain retweets and likes, because actually they're psychopathic. They have no empathy with the Palestinian people. That they actually only want to manipulate the situation to gain a bigger following for themselves.
Yeah, very well put. So we have in the studio Dr. Compier. He's a psychoanalyst from the from Netherlands, psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and Dr. Damir Rafi, who's a regular now on the show, also a psychiatrist.
And you're what are you? You're just like
I'm a magician.
You're a magician.
That was my main occupation.
Yeah.
So you're psychiatry.
You're a trainee psychiatrist, and I have the emotional IQ of an onion. So I mean,
he's got many layers. But as an ITU doctor, right? So
I'm completely out of my depth here with psychoanalytics.
No, I think everyone has, especially in ITU, you have experience with psychiatric patients. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't we go to our brothers and just get some thoughts on what we've just seen?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that you would do maybe as a psychotherapist is try to understand what Jordan Peterson is saying, and then.
We don't have a 3-hour stream available. I'm afraid.
Yeah, and so then you notice, that you don't really understand what he's saying, and then you think, why is it so difficult to understand? And I think he probably didn't really know himself what he was saying.
So there's a lack of clarity in his speech.
Yeah, so I think probably there was a lot of things that weren't clear in his own mind.
Yeah.
But the second thing that I thought was it is so problematic that Jordan Peterson is using this word psychopathic as a psychologist. It is not an official diagnosis, but still it is used for people who have a certain mental composition, and which his field of expertise is psychology. And because what happens is when you use a psychopathic as some word to how do you say?
Like stigmatize,
denigrate people.
Yes,
then it is something that is very harmful to do as a professional.
Oh, such a good point.
And what also happens is that it is creating a kind of new kind of heresy. So if you look from a religious point of view or from religious history, that people who have the wrong kind of opinion, who have the wrong kind of faith, they would be deemed heretics.
Yeah.
And it would be fine to hunt them down in a witch hunt. And it does sound like the kind of rhetoric where that could happen. So it's very harmful that he was doing this as a psychologist.
Yeah.
Can I just give a slightly different possible explanation as to your first point? So your first point was that maybe he doesn't know what he's saying. I would actually argue that he knows exactly what he wants to say, but he's trying to find the words to say it in a way which isn't inflammatory, because it is actually inflammatory. What he's effectively trying to say is, how do you stop people from expressing their opinions when they go beyond the pale and straight into what he considers should be, as you mentioned, heretical? But he's trying to cloak that in so many words so that it's not so obvious. And doing that is quite difficult. So he's trying to kind of navigate that path with his words.
I think his lack of clarity is that, but it's almost like he can't be honest with himself as to what he's doing, and he's trying to justify it in his head. And so he's trying to find a circuitous route to get the point which he feels he has to make for whatever reasons behind the scenes, but do it in a way which squares with his underlying philosophy that he's been talking about for many years, and it comes out as this jumble.
Yeah.
But I mean, fundamentally, especially contextually, we can understand that he is essentially calling for censorship.
Yeah.
And for deplatforming people.
Yeah.
That's my read on it.
He was much more clear in the early days when he was just a clinical psychologist.
Yeah.
And like, I listened to lots of his lectures, and it's quite a sad demise that he's turned from being actually a very reputable and interesting psychologist to listen to, now suddenly using psychological words and terms as political tools to justify hating on people who believe something different to him.
Yeah.
And I think, I thought that's really interesting. The other point I was going to make, sort of thinking about Jordan Peterson himself, was around the term, now he's trying to censor hate speech, basically, what he perceives as hate speech, which is in fact
Normal speech.
Or kind of criticizing Israeli, atrocities, basically.
Yeah.
And he did a really interesting lecture a few years ago where he talked about the fact that we need to platform hate speech, because if we don't, then hate speech will be driven underground and there it will fester. And then after that, one day it will rear its ugly head in the future.
Yeah.
And so he gave a very impassioned defense of that kind of speech that we disagree with you. Yeah, I really liked it. And I kind of found it, I wasn't sure, but I found it reasonably convincing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that he's completely switched the other way now that there's a political view that he doesn't want expressed.
Yeah. The sad demise of Jordan Peterson, actually, is what this is. Because a lot of people have seen him as a hero, and he has helped a lot of people. A lot of people swear by his methods, by what he said and how how it's helped him, especially a few years ago. And it seems like he's become increasingly politicized, but increasingly partisan. And now he's kind of really undermined his credibility, I think, in the last few years. What do you guys think about that? Do you think it's, I've seen lots of comments from people, young people, saying he really helped me, and I can't believe he's become who he is now. It's almost like he was a prophet, like he was seen as a prophet as such in a cultural sense, and he's been dethroned. Do you feel that way?
His book was quite interesting, his 12 Rules for Life, which was as interesting, but his initial book.
Yeah.
And it gave quite interesting guidance, and I could kind of see how for young men it would be useful. The thought of taking individual responsibility, trying to sort of overcome challenges that young people might face. It was kind of, some people might call it kind of quite stirring and motivational. And he always used to say that he's not left or right wing. He kind of aligned himself as being quite politically neutral and not really involved in the ins and outs of politics.
Yeah.
But now he's gone down this sort of very pro-Israel, perhaps pro-Donald Trump, but definitely right-wing kind of Daily Wire host.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting transformation, I think.
Yeah. Why do you think people get so attached to these kind of cultural figures that, like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate and that kind of thing? What is it that makes them so popular?
Yeah, good question. I would imagine that people would be looking for, role models. And Jordan Peterson, I think, also did fulfill this role in his personal struggle with his own problems, which he, I think, he got out of, like addiction and like not taking responsibility. You can really imagine from all his speeches what kind of life he was living and what he struggled himself out of.
Yeah.
And I think he did perform this role model for a lot of people.
Yeah. Brother Tahir, any thoughts?
I think that there's something very deep to there's a very deep point here, I think, with respect to his series of lectures, especially on the Bible.
Yeah.
So what he did was he did a lot of his psychoanalytic stuff. He did a lot of his personality stuff. He did a lot of his male-female gender dynamics. And people really loved that. And the thing that kind of then tapped into people in terms of their personal growth was that, in particular in the Judaeo-Christian sphere, was his kind of series of lectures psychoanalyzing the characters and the figures and the motifs within the biblical stories. And what he did was he effectively took the biblical stories as mythologies which told us eternal truths but weren't necessarily true.
Yeah.
And he used them to pin certain life lessons on those particular stories. And as a result, he kind of became very much taken in by the Judeo-Christian crowd, right? And I think that kind of sense of belonging is something that he was lacking. And by becoming a kind of role model, as you say, in a way he became attached to being a role model, to being a sensei, to being a man of wisdom for that particular community. So then when that community has come under attack, quite rightly so, right, for the Christians supporting the Israelis to bomb children to death, okay, then he feels that his power base is actually under threat, that his role for that community is to protect them as their sensei, as one of their mentors in society. And so I don't think he's not Christian in the real religious theological sense of the word, although perhaps he's converted, I don't know. He's certainly not Jewish, and he seems to have a breakdown every single time he starts talking about anything meaningful. He starts crying. He's now famous for it. There's plenty of memes out there. And I think a lot of that is that he's trying to demonstrate the meaning that crowd has for him. I mean, recently he started crying because he recounted about how Jewish people call him rabbi, and he started crying about that. I mean, it's so absurd.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's just... But it's just so fragile for a person who is all about stoicism and taking responsibility and resilience. It cries at every opportunity. It kind of tells you that he's continually signaling his need to belong to that community. So I think this is, if I'm going to psychoanalyze him, I'm going to say that actually he's quite insecure and lacking in belonging to a community. And this whole kind of biblical series gave him that community, which now he feels like kind of duty bound to protect at all costs.
Yes. And it is
so the only non-psychiatrist here.
Yeah.
Great points.
Spiritual
It's
depth.
doing all the psychoanalyzing.
You know,
psychoanalyzing.
we take you and you're part of the group.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Sorry, you were going to say?
What was it? Oh yeah, so it is quite a problematic way to protect the community, because how can you protect the community if you are legitimizing immorality and cruelty from this community? You should protect it by speaking out against the wrongdoings of your community.
That's being a real role model.
And it undermines everything that he used to say. He used to say, sort of, speak the truth at all costs. I think that was one of his rules for life.
Speak the truth no matter what.
Yeah. And I think
under your bed. No, sorry.
But
after making your bed, no.
But to me, I mean, I was interested in what he had to say, but now he shifted to this position. It's quite clear that he doesn't at all live by the rules he tries to tell others. And that's a shame.
Yeah, and I think there's also a point here. You were talking about this this biblical series, and what I'm about to say isn't that well worked out, so I would appreciate if you guys would help me. But, Jungian kind of... the Jungian approach, especially the cultural analysis that he did.
A lot of people won't have a clue what Jungian means.
Jordan Peterson fans will, for sure. But, Carl Jung was the famous psychoanalyst and psychiatrist that Jordan Peterson is particularly enamored with. And he's famous for his theory of archetypes, that many people and many stories will fall into archetypal patterns of particular types of heroes and particular motherly figures or this or that, the wise prophet or etc. Yeah, there are many potential archetypes. And what he did was he looked at the biblical stories from and essentially said that these are teaching us, these are true insofar as they are true archetypes, and we can learn from these archetypes. But the problem is that actually truth matters. Like actually what happened matters, because surely if you're going to derive the means by which to deal with real life, you need to have a framework that is based on actual reality. And if you have stories in the Bible, which is apparently from God, which is based actually not on real events, but on sort of psychological events, right? Then what are you really deriving from it? There has to be a ground reality to your religious beliefs. And, I'm reminded of the fact that Jordan Peterson, he said many years ago that actually his internal conflict has always been essentially between Christianity and science, and the fact that he couldn't reconcile the Bible with science, and therefore but he wanted religion. He wanted the Bible to be true. So I feel like he reinterpreted the Bible to excavate psychological truths and has made that his reality. But actually there is a real ground reality to religion, which is that if it's to mean anything really, Moses had to have done the things that he is said to have done. And Jesus had to have, there has to be some reality to Jesus, because what all the prophets show through their stories is actually nothing about, in our view, and I would argue this is the only meaningful take you can take from Scripture. It's not about education via archetypes. It's about a connection with God, and how a connection with God can save you in all kinds of adversity, and how those who have a relationship with God are morally steadfast in all these different circumstances and can embody virtues in all these different circumstances. So there has to be a reality to that. If there was never such reality, then who are our role models? Then how do we know that it's possible? So I think that the fact that he has untethered his religious philosophy from real fact and real truth has meant that his whole way of thinking has become untethered, and he's become attached to the group dynamics to which he belongs. Is another.
It's a very Christian way of dealing with Scripture,
Really?
probably, right?
Yeah.
Or with dogma. That if you have a dogma that cannot be understood, like the Trinity, then it just becomes mystified and metaphoricalized.
Right.
And then in a way it is true, but it is not completely true,
Right.
or not literally, or whatever.
And it all becomes very mysterious.
So I think he is mystified then. Also the Judaeo-Christian tradition. But if the mystified tradition starts slaughtering 40,000 children,
That's a good way of
then it's a different cup of tea.
I guess like if you treat the Bible like Aesop's fables, that's fine to do as a psychological exercise, and maybe it will give you some moral teachings. But I guess the whole purpose of religion ultimately is to, as you said, have role models, real people that we can look to from the past who have a relationship with God and say, this is how we're meant to live our lives. And I think if you have a story of a crocodile and a snake or whatever in Aesop's fables, we can't be the crocodile or the snake. And I think because of that, there's that distance. And maybe you can interpret that very intellectually and you can say, oh, that's a good lesson. But I think religion, for it to be a real living part of people's lives, it has to be a real living book with real living people that actually existed.
Yes. Can I start to compete? I mean, we've gone over your story and how you kind of came to Islam from a Christian type of background and from a Christian milieu, at least.
Well, it wasn't Christian. It was non-religious.
Right, but from a Christian society. Can you tell us? Can you give us a bit of an insight? Because you mentioned there about you feel this is somewhat typical. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? About this quality of Christianity? Do you feel like this is? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, I think it's not from my personal experience that I'm saying this, but more looking at history and looking at this way that that European culture has tried to reconcile the influx of, for example, science and education from Islam, which we talked about in different programs. And to reconcile it with a religion that was fundamentally opposed to these things, and which was opposed to scientific inquiry, which was opposed to educating yourselves to a level that you can critically think about things. And I think that my impression is from the history of European culture is that mystification is a way to do it. It's the separation of science and religion. And then the religion just becomes a kind of a mystified metaphor that is just floating somewhere you can derive meaning from if you need it, but if you don't need it, then it goes back into the mystified box.
Can I say there's a real significance, I think, to what you were saying there, which is that in practical terms, therefore, it ceases to be a practical religion. And this is something that actually I think is a consequence not only because of it's because Christianity was because the very nature of Christianity was that it was a religion which in its infancy sought to detach itself from the teachings of Judaism, the law of Judaism, and to take the example of Jesus solely on its own it was immediately impractical.
Yeah, well, maybe we have to also explain to our viewers that there are actually two very important currents in Christianity. So you have the Christianity that follows the example of Jesus, which is practical.
Yes.
And he followed the law.
Yeah.
And the other current in Christianity is the current that says that Jesus is God or part of God, and he died for our sins, and you have to worship him. And this current really has a very difficult relationship to practice, between theory and practice, and with Judaism as well.
Yeah.
Sorry. So just to
it's
make
absolutely
it clear
perfect.
for
I think it's really
the
important.
viewers.
Yeah, thank you very much, because I think a lot of our viewers may not be aware, when we talk about Christianity, we're talking about that strand, which is Paulinism, effectively. Which
what does that mean, Paulinism?
The religion of Paul.
Saint Paul.
Saint Paul, who said that the law of Judaism is a curse, and by Jesus dying for your sins, you don't need to follow the law. In other words, you don't need to keep the Sabbath, you don't need to keep the dietary requirements, you don't need to actually. It's not you don't have to follow the law of God or the teachings of God to enter heaven and for God to be pleased with you. And I think the consequence of that is they lost an enormous bulk of religious teachings, which got replaced by just like pithy quotes of Jesus. Like, for example, turn the other cheek is a really good example.
Yeah. Well, I think actually it wasn't even replaced by those. I think it was just replaced by the church system, by priesthood, because a mystified reality needs priests to make the translation towards the ordinary people.
Yeah.
And I think this was the replacement.
That's a wonderful point.
And sometimes they would take things from the Bible, sometimes they would take things from Jesus, but it would always be in the service of this system.
That's a perfect point. That's what I was actually I didn't clock that, actually, so thank you very much for bringing that in. And actually, therefore, because it was impractical, I was going to give the example of turn the other cheek, but at the same time they did the Crusades, because the church told them to do the Crusades. So in actual fact, their religion was immediately impractical, and so they took a different structure as their religion. And in the modern day, that's kind of, especially for the Christians in America, for example, that's become the state. The state religion. The state is the religion. Yeah. The president is their prophet. And so that, in a way, has replaced the church for a lot of them. The church is still there, but I think the state is a big part of the religious fervor of American Christians, and that's a lot of what's driving what's happening in Israel. And in fact, if you look at it from that perspective, even Judaism has fallen under that sway, with Israel being the state idol.
Yeah. And I think it's particularly ironic that Jordan Peterson has ended up supporting de facto these people, because his kind of interpretation of Christianity is much more mystified, metaphorical, and yet Israel's claim to the land is based on an apparently completely objective biblical reality. Right? So this is a strange contradiction. And I think the way you put it, this mystification is really important, because, to be honest, I think that is his religion, this mystified Christianity, and he's very immersed in it, and so it comes out in his character of essentially kind of incoherence and a total lack of clarity. You see, nowadays, especially because he's gone off what, to be honest, are somewhat basic or more simple self-help topics and into kind of doctrine, as it were, he has become completely unclear. And he's very difficult to follow, and you have to really kind of tease out what he's saying.
Yeah, maybe he feels that he has become a priest for this mystified kind of religion or culture, and it is a very uncomfortable position, I think, to have.
Yes.
That would explain the suits and the costumes, I'll be honest with you.
It's new robes.
It really would.
There's many years ago, we did videos on Jordan Peterson, and we said, I think 4 or 5 years ago now, that he is essentially an apologist for a Judeo-Christian worldview of Judeo-Christian supremacy. So Peterson, unfortunately, here I think it betrays a tendency towards a cultural supremacy. Yeah, towards thinking we are right, we're this fruitful catastrophe, and that essentially what's underlying the things he says is
fear of Islam.
Yes.
Fear of Muslims.
Is
fear of the brown man.
Yeah, something fairly basic culturally.
Although he's about as non-brown as you get.
Yes.
That's what they fear. That's what they fear. They fear you. You are their worst nightmare. You know that?
Well,
compare.
Yeah.
But what would you say to many of his...
I'm dangerous.
That was the nicest "I'm dangerous" I've ever heard.
Yeah.
What would you say to his potentially dejected followers? Because many of his followers have become disillusioned. Is there any kind of message that you would have for them?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately the idea that our culture is Judeo-Christian is just not true.
Right.
And even if you mystify it, it will still not help. It is a very, it is maybe something that we've been living with for hundreds of years now. This idea that everything came from the Greeks and the Romans and Christianity and all, but so many things came from Islam and from that part of the world that we are now thinking is opposed to this tradition of ours.
Yeah.
And I think we, at least if you don't want, if becoming Muslim is too big a step, you can at least include the contributions of Muslim societies to Europe in your worldview, so that you don't think that these countries and these people can just be destroyed as they were destroyed during the Crusades, when Christians would think that everyone except their specific type of Christianity is like an animal.
So what you're saying is this kind of Judeo-Christian worldview where everything good has come from the Judeo-Christian milieu and Judeo-Christian framework means that you see a lack of value in people who are outside of that system, and therefore that then enables you to justify their killing and their slaughtering for the sake of that Judeo-Christian framework.
Yeah, it is still quite a typical Christian framework to be in, because I think one of the most harmful things about Christianity is that it is so exclusive that the people who are not in your type of church, it's not even only the Christians. It is only the specific type of Christian that is in your church. They are the only humans, and the other people are basically animals, or even worse, they are devils.
Yeah.
And you can see this in the example of the Crusaders sacking Constantinople, I think 13th century, where they massacred everybody because they were just not part of their church.
Yeah, they were Christians, right?
Yeah,
but a lot of people
and they killed huge number of Jews on the way as well.
Yeah,
Crusades.
The first crusade began with them, slaughtering Jews in Europe. But a lot of people think about Islam like that now. I mean, if you talk to an ordinary person on the street and you talk about which one's more intolerant, Christianity or Islam, I think majority of people would say Islam because that's the picture. But is that? I mean, would either of you be able to, or any of you be able to talk about that?
I guess just going back to what you were saying about the Judeo-Christian narrative, I saw it was actually a TikTok, but it was a very interesting video about lots of mathematical concepts. So there are concepts like Bernoulli's principle, I think Pascal's law. These were created by Westerners, and so they're named after those Western creators. But then formulas like the quadratic formula, it's not given a name, it's not named after somebody, and that's because it was devised by a Muslim. And there's lots of formulas like that. So the ones typically that aren't named after a person were actually because they were named, it was actually Muslims that created them. And then there's other theories like Pythagoras' theory. That wasn't Pythagoras' theorem, like the Egyptians knew about it. It was well known even before that, but they give it the Western name. So I think it's interesting, like what you were saying about Judeo-Christian culture kind of permeating and them deliberately sort of rewriting history so as to exclude that Arab-Muslim influence.
Well, I could go on. There's the issue of the Byzantine Empire. Roy Casagrande covers this beautifully about they weren't the Byzantines, they were the Romans.
Yeah.
And they rewrote history retrospectively to say the Byzantine Empire was destroyed by the Muslims, and actually Rome fell much before Islam. When actually the Byzantines at the time considered themselves Roman, called themselves Roman, everybody was Roman.
And the Arabs considered them Romans.
And the Arabs considered them Romans, and the Quran refers to them as Romans. And the reason they retrospectively effaced the name Romans and made them the Byzantines was because they did not want to face the painful issue for them, which is that the Muslims basically destroyed the Roman Empire. And even to this day, you get Christians online, lamenting the fall of Constantinople. It's like, it's in the 15th century, guys. Like, get over it.
Yeah. And what about this one that Roy also sometimes, that Mr. Casagrande also covered sometimes, but it could have been included in this analysis, that the Ottomans, who took over Constantinople 200 years after this event that we just talked about, they also saw themselves as the continuation of the Roman Empire, but now Muslim.
No. Yeah.
You know, the Roman Empire became Christian at one point, and now it is a Muslim empire.
Yeah, and I believe even the star and crescent.
Yeah, it is a
was a symbol of Constantinople, actually, which is now been adopted as the Islamic symbols, but actually it wasn't the original.
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
yes, I mean the Prophet Muhammad didn't.
It's just the black flags, right?
Yeah, the Prophet Muhammad would send people in the battles. There would be a flag, and it was typically the white or black. It wouldn't have symbols on it. So
wow. And
sorry, you go.
Okay, thanks.
Spider-Man meme.
So what I wanted to say about this thing that the people now see Islam in the way that actually Christianity was or is, so meaning exclusive and violent and
intolerant,
warring. You could use a psychoanalytic concept to explain that, which is projection. And I think that Europeans have used the Muslim world for centuries as a projection screen,
right?
Where they would project what they wanted to be, or what they didn't want to be, or what they were afraid of being. Like, for example, they would project all their sexual fantasies on the Muslim world, where they would say it is, there is so much frivolous everything,
licentiousness, and
at some point. But then now they would say, no, now the Muslim world is extremely strict, right? So you could use this term of projection to think about what actually is in their mind. I think Islam it also is an argument for the power of Islam, that it is used always as this projection screen, because we don't do it with Hinduism or Buddhism.
And I don't think Muslims do it with Christianity either.
No. We're largely oblivious to Christianity.
Yeah, which comes back to that issue of security and insecurity. This whole cultural supremacist, current. I think it reeks of actual cultural insecurity, and it's this repression of the reality that actually many of the good things in our world have been inherited from an Islamic culture and an Islamic background, and that's okay. That's we're all humans, and we've all learned from one from the other. And funnily enough, the Muslim world and the Arabs, and the Arabs and the Persians, they didn't have the same hang-ups about learning from other cultures and from other
they loved it.
Yeah, what's Arabic numerals were Indian numerals plus
in
zero.
fact, they were excessively attached to Greek theories. I mean, if they had just...
And attributing the credit back to others.
It's ridiculous.
And the fact that all this projection happens, it is interesting, because actually the Quran as a book is the only book that can actually rebut all of those allegations. And it's an objective... It does have that law, that moral teaching that Christianity lacks. And I think if you were to raise an allegation against Christianity or the Old Testament or New Testament, you would find contradictions there. It would be very hard to defend a particular viewpoint. Whereas in the Quran, if someone were to say, the Quran teaches, God forbid, sexual perversion, or too strict in the matters of that, you could actually look to the Quran and you could find the answer and the solution. And I think with the case, what you were saying about kind of turning the other cheek, people think that Islam is a more violent or a more barbaric religion because that's not what it teaches. But actually, the turn the other cheek teaching is not practical. You can't live by that in normal life. And Islam has that balance and that moderation, whereby it says if you can forgive, then do. But that's always the best thing. But actually, you do have rights. Well, it's not always the
best thing. If it leads to
reformation, if it leads to reformation, it's the best thing. But otherwise, you do have a right to inflict upon someone else what they've done to you, but you shouldn't exceed that. And I think those kind of balance and moderation within Islam is something that other religions lack. And all of these kind of projections, allegations that there are, can be rebutted just in that one book.
It's a wonderful point, and I think the turn the other cheek, it leads. I guess what you're going on from what you're saying is it leaves a vacuum. Because it's impractical, you have to seek something else, which comes into the church, steps into it, fills that vacuum, and that might be as barbaric as whoever the priest is.
Then it's just human desires.
And then it's just human desires. And the other point I want to make is that Islam is conceived of as intolerant, but it's the only religion that recognizes the divine origin of every other religion. And that goes back to that point about Christianity being so exclusive. But actually, as a Muslim, we have to recognize the truth of Jesus, of Moses, for example, of Abraham, of the prophets of God, of other faiths. And if we don't, we aren't true Muslims. But if they recognize the truth of Muhammad, they aren't true Christians. So it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, that's definitely a complex.
Tolerance is mandated. Not even tolerance, but acceptance is mandated in Islam, and it's not tolerated in other faiths.
Yeah. And also this issue of science and religion, like we've been saying, Islam as a culture produced so many scientific discoveries, but also within the Quran itself, it's actually not only, it does not contradict science, but actually many scientific discoveries validate the Quran. Like, for instance, very simply, the Big Bang verse in chapter 21, do not the disbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were a closed up mass, a ratak, which has the connotation of something which is seamless, something which is dark, and then we opened them out, and from water we made every living thing. So a kind of amazing verse, and there are others, and we can show this on the screen now. Islam doesn't have these issues. In fact, science is a boon for Islam. And I think that gets back to this more fundamental issue, which Jordan Peterson, and I do have sympathy with him, struggles with, and I have sympathy with all Christians in this respect, which is that if you are trapped within thinking that religion is only found within the Bible and that Muslims are barbarians, then you can't find God that way. Right? Whereas actually, if you're able to open your heart to the possibility that actually the Quran is true and that Muslims may have the truth, even though many are not good role models of true Islam, then actually you may find exactly what you've been looking for, which is a rational and scientific text which gives you a strong moral law, and the manifestation of which has greatly benefited the world, including the so-called Judaeo-Christian world.
Yeah, a pithy way to put it would be a rational religion.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
And
true Islam.
And on that note,
yeah. So thank you very much for watching. Please do like, comment, and subscribe, and catch you in the next one.